Hello, everybody. This is Helmo Pape. I'm sending my best wishes from Vienna, Austria, to you at the Bienne Conference 2022. We're here at the session called Ecological Justice, and I would like to introduce you to our first presenter, who is Andrew White from the King's College in London. And he will present his input called Degrowth and UBI, the case of the UK. Please, Andrew, have your presentation.
Okay, thanks for that, Helmo. And I won't reintroduce myself because you've done it very well. And also, I think I did it in the video. So I pre-recorded this session because I wasn't sure how the internet was going to work this morning. So I won't say too much because it lasts about 19 minutes, but I would welcome any questions or comments at the end. I should apologize in advance that I recorded this twice, and this version you see, I didn't have the slides on full screen. So when you get some of the graphs, it might be quite difficult to see them, but I think I've uploaded my slides. So, you know, if there's something that's not clear, then hopefully at some point in the future, you can have a look at those slides. So without further ado, I will start this, and hopefully, let me just enlarge it. Hopefully you'll be able to see this on full screen. So should this be Helmo with, it says play video with video audio or play video with speaker audio? Which do you know which one is best?
Audio and video.
Okay, let me. Hi everyone, I'm Andrew White, a senior lecturer in the Department of Culture, Media and Creative Industries at King's College London. What I want to talk about today is degrowth. So I want to link discussions of degrowth within the UK to the advocacy for universal basic income. So essentially what I'm trying to do is to say that is try to convince, and I guess this is very much a political argument, to convince people that over time, either growth is going to not be as pronounced as it has been in the past, or indeed, more persuasively, that because of the climate crisis, growth cannot be the same level that it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. So we need to move towards a situation where economic growth is not as impressive as it was in the past. For this, I have to say that I've been very much, actually you can't see it, I think you can see it here, I've been very much inspired by this particular book, Donut Economics, which you might know. I'm pretty sure I'm not the first person at this conference to have talked about this, by Kate Raworth. And there is a chapter here, she's talking about how we reconstruct the economy to take into consideration the climate crisis. And in chapter 7, she talks about be agnostic about growth. And that's really what I want to talk about. But I obviously want to give my own perspective, and I want to look at this from the perspective of the UK. So what I'm going to do now is share my screen so I can show the presentation. Okay, let's begin then with the presentation. So I think what we can really say here is that economic growth is very much dependent on the efficient use of energy resources. You know, if you want to grow your economy as efficiently and quickly as possible, then you need to use energy resources, and you need to use them in the most efficient way. The problem, of course, is that we're beginning to run out of those conventional energy sources, and now we're moving towards non-traditional, unconventional fossil fuel reserves. And those reserves or those means of extracting fossil fuels are less efficient. So things like fracking, for instance, is less efficient. I'm talking here about economic inefficiency. I'm not talking for now about, of course, the great environmental damage that this causes. This is a problem, again, economically, because investment and job creation are reliant on continuing economic growth. So someone like me or anyone else comes along and says we're not going to have such great economic growth in the future, then that is seen as deeply problematic. So one solution to this will be to find new, more efficient ways of generating energy. But as I've just said, unconventional extractions of fossil fuels is inefficient. If we look to renewable energy, if we look to nuclear energy, then that will take a generation to fully develop. So really, we're not going to be able to use energy or utilize energy in a sufficient or an efficient way in the next 20 years or so. And indeed, this is not necessarily a bad thing, because we want to reduce energy, because energy reduction is crucial to dealing with the climate crisis. So while economists will say, well, isn't it a problem that we cannot utilize or generate energy in this efficient way? And environmentalists would say, well, actually, we're looking at the wrong thing. We need to reduce energy. So in order to do that, we have to prepare for a world in which growth is anemic. Of course, the problem with this, especially in democracies, is that this is difficult to sell politically. If you are a politician and you go into an election and say, well, hey, look, my opponent is saying that we're going to have economic growth for the next 5 or 10 years, very impressive economic growth. I'm going to tell you there's going to be little or no economic growth in the next 5 or 10 years, and that's a good thing. Of course, people will say, well, that we will lose jobs, that will lower the standard of living. How can that be a good thing? And that politician will find it very difficult to win the election, as it were. So that is something we need to think very carefully about, and there's something I'm going to touch on throughout this presentation. How do we make the political argument? From this, though, we can assume two things. If we agree that economic growth, or the means of making energy extraction more efficient is not going to be successful in the coming decades, technological advances will not prevent declining growth. Whether or not politicians acknowledge this, and of course a lot of politicians won't acknowledge this process is inevitable, and indeed, if we want to deal with the climate crisis properly, desirable. So this paper is concerned with tackling one of the problems associated with this, namely how we deal with the potential decline in living standards, how we deal with something like the potential loss of jobs. What we can say at this moment in time is that the ongoing global pandemic and the energy crisis, exacerbated, of course, by the war in Ukraine, has reinforced, in a sense, a long-term stagnation of many Western countries. If we look at OECD figures, by 2050, growth in OECD nations is projected to only be 0.9%. It'll be higher in non-OECD countries, but as those countries become more wealthy and they close the gap between themselves and the OECD nations, then they too will see falling growth as well. We're also seeing in some countries, though, of course, not.
Let's see. Oh, shit.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew White, a senior lecturer in the Department of Culture, Media and Creative Industries at King's College London. What I want to talk about today is degrowth. So I want to link discussions of degrowth within the UK to the advocacy for universal basic income. So essentially what I'm trying to do is to say that is try to convince, and I guess this is very much a political argument, to convince people that over time, either growth is going to not be as pronounced as it has been in the past, or indeed more persuasively that because of the climate crisis, growth cannot be the same level that it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. So we need to move towards a situation where economic growth is not as impressive as it was in the past. For this, I have to say that I've been very much, actually you can't see it, I think you can see it here, I've been very much inspired by this particular book, Donut Economics, which you might know. I'm pretty sure I'm not the first person at this conference to have talked about this, by Kate Rayworth. And there is a chapter here. She's talking about how we reconstruct the economy to take into consideration the climate crisis. And in chapter 7, she talks about be agnostic about growth. And that's really what I want to talk about. But I obviously want to give my own perspective, and I want to look at this from the perspective of the UK. So what I'm going to do now is share my screen so I can show the presentation. Okay, let's begin then with the presentation. So I think what we can really say here is that economic growth is very much dependent on the efficient use of energy resources. If you want to grow your economy as efficiently and quickly as possible, then you need to use energy resources and you need to use them in the most efficient way. The problem, of course, is that we're beginning to run out of those conventional energy sources, and now we're moving towards non-traditional, unconventional fossil fuel reserves. And those reserves or those means of extracting fossil fuels are less efficient. So things like fracking, for instance, is less efficient. I'm talking here about economic inefficiency. I'm not talking for now about, of course, the great environmental damage that this causes. This is a problem, again, economically, because investment and job creation are reliant on continuing economic growth. So someone like me or anyone else comes along and says we're not going to have such great economic growth in the future, then that is seen as deeply problematic. So one solution to this will be to find new, more efficient ways of generating energy. But as I've just said, unconventional extractions of fossil fuels is inefficient. If we look to renewable energy, if we look to nuclear energy, then that will take a generation to fully develop. So really, we're not going to be able to use energy or utilize energy in a sufficient or an efficient way in the next 20 years or so. And indeed, this is not necessarily a bad thing, because we want to reduce energy, because energy reduction is crucial to dealing with the climate crisis. So while economists will say, well, isn't it a problem that we cannot utilize or generate energy in this efficient way? And environmentalists will say, well, actually, we're looking at the wrong thing. We need to reduce energy. So in order to do that, we have to prepare for a world in which growth is anemic. Of course, the problem with this, especially in democracies, is that this is difficult to sell politically. If you are a politician and you go into an election and say, well, hey, look, my opponent is saying that we're going to have economic growth for the next 5 or 10 years, very impressive economic growth. I'm going to tell you there's going to be little or no economic growth in the next 5 or 10 years, and that's a good thing. Of course, people will say, well, that we will lose jobs, that will lower the cost, the standard of living. How can that be a good thing? And that politician will find it very difficult to win the election, as it were. So that is something we need to think very carefully about, and there's something I'm going to touch on throughout this presentation. How do we make the political argument? From this, though, we can assume two things. If we agree that economic growth, or the means of making energy extraction more efficient is not going to be successful in the coming decades, technological advances will not prevent declining growth. Whether or not politicians acknowledge this, and of course a lot of politicians won't acknowledge this process is inevitable, and indeed, if we want to deal with the climate crisis properly, desirable. So this paper is concerned with tackling one of the problems associated with this, namely how we deal with the potential decline in living standards, how we deal with something like the potential loss of jobs. What we can say at this moment in time is that the ongoing global pandemic and the energy crisis, exacerbated, of course, by the war in Ukraine, has reinforced, in a sense, a long-term stagnation of many Western countries. If we look at OECD figures, by 2050, growth in OECD nations is projected to only be 0.9%. It'll be higher in non-OECD countries, but as those countries become more wealthy and they close the gap between themselves and the OECD nations, then they too will see falling growth as well. We're also seeing in some countries, though of course not all, but certainly in developed countries, we're seeing a population which is either stagnating or even falling. So in Japan, for instance, we see population has been falling in recent years, and I'm going to show you some figures to illustrate that. Even in China, we see this recent Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences research, which predicted that by 2100, so what's that, 75 plus years time, the Chinese population might be less than 600 million. I mean, this is astonishing given that it's 1.4 billion people now. So in a sense, this is not necessarily slow growth in the economic sense, but of course it will translate into slow growth. Fewer people means fewer productivity. It also means that we do not need as much growth because we're not and supporting as many people as we might have done in the past. Such a scenario will require states to think more carefully about how to allocate existing resources rather than growing the economy. This will, of course, involve redistribution from the rich to the poor. Also, in those kind of countries where population is declining, there will be a disproportionate number of older people. So it will also mean redistribution from the economically active to the economically inactive. Of course, this is what UBI, Universal Basic Income, is all about, redistributing from people who can work to those who are not working. Let's then look at some statistics. So we can see the population total in Japan. This is from 1990 to 2021, but we can see from just after 2000, we can see a real decline there. Growth in GDP as well from about 1991. It's fairly level with these huge troughs here. So we had the financial crisis and the ongoing pandemic. But we see unemployment in Japan is quite steady. It did go up a little bit, you know, about 15 years ago, but it's down now to about 2%. So I think the thing here to think about is that, you know, no growth or very little growth is not a disaster. I mean, if you've been to Japan, as I have recently, well, 2 or 3 years ago anyway, you know, it's a beautiful functioning society where, you know, there's a lot of social cohesion. And it's quite prosperous. So this idea that if we have little or no economic growth, it'll be a complete disaster is not borne out when we look at Japan. Interestingly, when I looked at this, and I didn't really expect this, I thought Japan was an outlier. But then when I look at economic growth in the United States and the United Kingdom as well, I see they're not too dissimilar from Japan. So what we might say is that rather than Japan being an outlier, this might be something that is consistent across the OECD nations. And again, it reinforces the view that perhaps growth over time in those nations is going to stall, if not decline. So that then leads us to think about how we might support people who are economically inactive, if it is indeed the case that growth stalls, and that means that fewer jobs are being created. So, of course, I'm going to eventually go and talk about the universal basic income. But, of course, one of the arguments against the universal basic income is that we don't want to intervene in the free market. That's certainly what neoliberal governments like the current UK's government will say, and also that it's too expensive. But look at what has happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is the House of Commons library figures on the amount of money that was spent on COVID measures in the UK over a 2-year period. Between 310 and 410 billion pounds. That's a huge amount of money, equivalent to between 4,600 and 6,100 pounds per person in the UK. If we think about that in terms of a universal basic income, if we take children out, because you probably wouldn't give children money if there's a universal basic income, you would just give it to people of working age, then that would amount to about £8,000 per person or something like that. Of course, that's over 2 years, so it's not enough for a universal basic income. But the point is, there is a precedent. There is a principle here that we can intervene in the market. We can give huge amounts of money to people who are economically inactive. And when I talk about people being economically inactive, that's where a lot of the money went. So if we look at the UK's coronavirus job retention scheme, which ran from March 2020 to September 2021, so over an 18-month period, we see it supported 11.7 million jobs at a cost of £70 billion, funding up to 80% of individual employees' wages. So again, it's not a universal basic income, but in a sense, it is funding people's income, or up to 80% of it. And it's doing it in a way that's quite bureaucratic. If we had a universal basic income, it's much easier to administer, it's less costly. This kind of means-tested approach is bureaucratic, but also open to fraud and abuse as well. And we might say, well, you know, this is only a short-term temporary measure, and, you know, given that UK has a neoliberal government, then we cannot expect this to be any part of a long-term trend. However, this month, the UK government announced a freeze in energy prices. And how is it going to pay for that? Well, it'll pay for that through increased borrowing, up to £100 billion. Now, at the moment, and by the time I'm actually taking questions about this presentation at the conference itself, There will have been a mini budget, so we'll know exactly how much money this will cost and over how many years it's going to support people. But I would suggest that this is going to be supporting people for at least 2 years, probably into next year, into the year after that. And then because there's going to be an election in 2024, 2025, I doubt whether they're going to stop it right before an election. So what we can see from 2020 to around 2025 in the UK are these huge government interventions in the market. So if we hear these arguments that, oh, well, we cannot fund a UBI, it's just too expensive, or we should not intervene in the free market. Well, I think here's the answer, at least in relation to what we see in the UK. So the UK government, of course, formally is opposed to UBI, but I think these interventions amount to significant and unconditional medium-term financial support for UK citizens. And indeed, if the windfall tax on energy companies that was put in place in early 2022, if that had been replicated in the latest package, this could have established the idea or reinforced the idea that heavily taxing fossil fuel companies to finance citizens' living standards is a good thing. And I'm asking this question, which I guess in many ways is rhetorical: could a UBI not be funded in this way? So accepting that it might not be possible to, or nor environmentally sustainable to create jobs at the same rate as today, we should embrace things like non-work, voluntary work, civic activities, childcare, domestic work, and so on and so forth. This would enable, or UBI would enable people to pursue these activities, these meaningful activities, rather than being forced to take on meaningless jobs, which are not all just personally meaningless, but also they might cause more damage to the environment. What is the point of having this job if it's creating a lot of plastic, if it's ensuring that I'm traveling into work every day by car when we really don't need to do that? It's not good for environmental sustainability. To a certain degree, this could be funded by money generated from the burning of fossil fuels. But over time, if you think about it, we want to be generating less money from the burning of fossil fuels. So over time, in the developed nations at least, we would use income tax to fund this form of UBI. So this requires a paradigm shift, I think, intellectually, to move away from our obsession with economic growth. And in this sense, I think the high-income countries, as Kate Raworth herself has suggested, should lead the way. They can provide a normative model for how to transition from a high carbon to low or zero carbon society. And that is because, you know, low income countries still have to use a lot of energy to develop themselves up to a certain level of income before they can think more concretely about renewable energy and stuff like that. And Paul argued in 2021 in this UNESCO paper that actually, ideally, the uses of taxes on carbon to fund such a transition could be done at a global level. So what he's asking for is the richer nations to fund things like the development of renewable energy UBI schemes in the poorer nations on Earth. Now, in many ways, I kind of oscillate between pessimism and optimism. And if I was to be pessimistic, I would say, well, if you look at the oncoming or the incoming Truss administration, then all they've talked about is growth, growth, growth. We need economic growth. That will get Britain out of this particular problematic situation it's in at the moment. So I don't think anything's going to happen for the next year or two. However, what we have in place in the UK are a number of metrics which do measure things other than economic growth. National well-being, this was something that was established about 10 years ago. So we do measure things, not just GDP, but things like national well-being. There are other things that are measured as well. Natural capital, I don't have time to show you, but you can click on this link and have a look at it. So impact of economic growth on the environment. There's things like household satellite accounts, which means let's look at stuff that's being done in households like childcare, domestic work, and so on and so forth. And let's try to cost that. So we're not just saying that GDP should be made up of stuff that traditionally creates, makes money, as it were, creates products that we can sell commercially. It's about all forms of activity, activity that we don't, in the market sense, give a cost to. But actually, if we think about this more widely, if we think about cost as you know, having a sustainable society, then we should take all those things into consideration. So part of this is about reconfiguring GDP. GDP is quite useful. It's quite simple and quite a simple measure of how a country is doing. The problem is we get kind of fixated with it, you know, and we compare ourselves with other nations. If we can turn that around and say, well, let's compete on the basis of sustainability, then we will reorientate our public policy towards that rather than economic growth. So concluding thoughts then, it is neither likely nor desirable that the UK will achieve robust growth in the long term. That's what I'm arguing here. And in that sense, there's an opportunity to redefine what is meant by GDP, to use some kind of metric which focuses more on well-being and environmental sustainability. Significant government intervention is therefore likely to be a continuing feature in the UK economy. I don't see this as merely a temporary thing. As I say, if we look from 2020 to 25, there's been significant intervention. I think that will continue, especially if we get a new government coming to power in 2024, 2025. Where there is this intervention, it's important that these interventions are redistributive, with UBI being a vital component, because UBI, in a sense, redistributes money from the richer citizens of society to the poorer citizens of society. And as Paul suggests, we can think about that in terms of nations as well, how, you know, environmental sustainability, which is, you know, which can be developed in the higher income nations, can then be used as not just a template for poorer nations, but those high income nations can fund nations that don't have as much money, as it were. What I was saying, the UK's situation is that what I'm talking about here, what I have talked about, is unlikely to happen under the present government, although I do say, as I've said, that they will continue to spend a lot of money in these market interventions, but they are unlikely to introduce UBI. But I think the long-term trend is clear. It's low growth, if not no growth. There'll be a huge loss of jobs. And then we will have to think, well, what are we going to do in the long term with those people who are economically inactive? And I think that's where you make the case for UBI. I'll just finish by showing you some of the references I've used, and if these slides are shared later, then you can click on those at your own leisure. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for your brilliant presentation. I would like to skip the Q&A session for your presentation because it is a bit of a longer one, but I'm very convinced that we will have some time for questions near the end of the session. So I encourage the audience to write questions to Andrew here into the forum, in the chat forum, and would like to hand over with not much of additional ado to Nick Langridge. He's from the University of Bath and would like to present us the input UBI and the climate crisis. What role for UBI in a just transition? Nick, if you're ready, please present us your input.
Thank you very much. My name's Nick Langridge. I'm a PhD student at the University of Bath, where my research concerns the ecological credentials of basic income. And I'm specifically looking at its potential role in any transition to a more sustainable post-growth society. So in my presentation today, I want to briefly examine what I think we mean by a just and green transition, and then discuss the potential that basic income has to play a key role in this transition. So just to give a very quick outline of what I'm hoping to cover. First, I'll talk very briefly about the ecological crisis, where we are at the moment, and then move on to look at the debate between green growth and post-growth approaches to addressing the ecological crises. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, as Andrew's already covered that really well. I'm just going to basically make the point that based on my research and from my perspective, any just and green transition needs to take a post-growth perspective. I'm then going to move on and look at how ecological considerations have featured within the basic income literature, and also how they've been included within the empirical research, and discuss some of the reasons why basic income is considered to have an important role to play in a green transition. And I'll end with a few concluding points regarding where we currently stand with regards to our understanding of basic income's ecological credentials, and also regarding the research I think we need going forward. So we all know the world is facing ecological crisis. In 2009, Johan Rockström and colleagues identified 9 planetary boundaries which marked the safe operating space for humanity with respect to the Earth system. And these place critical limits on climate change, biodiversity loss, land use change, amongst others. Crossing any one of these thresholds could potentially have disastrous consequences for humanity. However, as of 2015, we've moved out of the safe space on at least 4 of these boundaries. Greenhouse gas concentrations are currently at a 3 million year high, and the latest IPCC report suggests that the world is on course for 3.2 degrees of warming by the end of the century, even if all promised mitigation policies are implemented. In addition, 75% of land use has been severely altered, and 25% of all plant and animal species are at risk of extinction within decades. Biogeochemical flows are at more than double safe levels, and by 2050 it's expected that the world will be consuming more than 3 times the sustainable rate of resources. Now, the consequences for crossing any one of these boundaries fall overwhelmingly on the poor. Therefore, as a policy which seeks to reduce poverty, inequality, and insecurity, we need to consider basic income's ecological implications and also how it can be implemented in a way which would reduce our pressure on the environment. So there are differing views on how to address the ecological crises, and I won't spend too much time on this slide because, as I said, Andrew's already covered some of this. But more mainstream approaches involve the continued pursuit of economic growth, albeit clean or green growth. And green growth perspectives argue that through technological innovation, we can absolutely decouple GDP growth from environmental pressures, and in theory, therefore, allow economic growth to continue indefinitely. Green growth is therefore the central policy objective of modern capitalist economies, and it also underpins international policy agreements such as the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2015 Paris Agreement, amongst some others. However, post-growth perspectives challenge the assumptions which underpin green growth. And when I say post-growth here, I'm using it as an umbrella term to cover all of the growth critical literature, including degrowth, steady-state economics, donut economics, A-growth, and some of the post-development literature as well. So very briefly, the post-growth literature challenges green growth on several fronts. First, recent studies have shown that the absolute decoupling of GDP growth from environmental pressures is not occurring and is also unlikely to be possible in the future at the rate required. As a result of this, the vast majority of IPCC scenarios for remaining below 2 degrees of warming are reliant on negative emissions technologies, which climate scientists have labelled as risky, high-stakes gambles. At the same time, the vast majority of new wealth created through economic growth goes to the richest sections of the population. A recent Oxfam report found that of all the wealth created in 2017, 82% went to the richest 1%, which shows that economic growth is an inefficient method at best for reducing poverty and inequality. And as Andrew already pointed out, there's several scholars are arguing that we're currently entering a long-term economic slump or secular stagnation, and so a post-growth world may be inevitable whether we like it or not. Post-growth perspectives therefore demand the abandonment of GDP growth as the overriding policy goal, and instead prioritise the satisfaction of human needs while downscaling energy and resource use in order to remain compatible with planetary boundaries. The burden of any downscaling would of course have to be borne by the rich, which would therefore allow the poor to continue to increase resource use in order to satisfy their needs. Now, in my work, I employ the precautionary principle and therefore reject the possibility of green growth. I therefore argue that any just or green transition has to be built on post-growth perspectives. And when I refer to the green transition in the remainder of this presentation, it's one that does embrace these perspectives that I'm referring to. So what role could basic income play in such a transition? So basic income has been advocated by Green parties since the 1970s, and it also features regularly and generally favourably in much of the post-growth literature. The link between basic income and the environment is therefore not new. However, the empirical evidence to support basic income's ecological credentials is limited, with its role in a just and green transition under-researched. A study in 2019 found that less than 1% of the academic literature on basic income addressed the natural environment, and the evidence to support it as an ecological policy was therefore severely limited. Furthermore, some of my previous research has found that ecological questions are largely under-addressed in basic income pilots, with most interventions for various reasons, various understandable reasons, aligning more with green growth than post-growth perspectives. There is also a lack of focus by pilots on changes to material or ecological footprints, or to changes in consumption from an ecological perspective. Now, there has been some progress on this in the last few years. For example, yesterday we saw a presentation by Cool Earth about the pilot that they're planning in the rainforests and how that has an ecological focus. But in general, the empirical evidence does still remain scarce. However, if we were to review the available literature, we can see some of the ways in which basic income is believed to be able to play an important role in a just and green transition. Now, it's impossible for me to be able to cover everything here, so I'm just going to try and introduce some of the key areas that basic income could play this role. I seem to have lost the slides.
You can access them again from the left menu.
Yes, so one of the ways in which basic income could contribute to a just or green transition is through its ability to reduce inequality. We've had previous sessions at this conference which have looked at this and shown how basic income does have a strong potential in this area. Now, from an ecological perspective, more equal societies are generally more sustainable, and there is a correlation between greater equality and lower environmental pressures. Inequality is also known to make people more materialistic, and people with materialistic values tend to have more negative attitudes towards the environment. The redistributive potential of basic income, and therefore its potential to help reduce the gap between the rich and the poor, could therefore have strong ecological implications. Greater inequality could also help to reduce consumerism and overconsumption of material resources in society. The wealth effect refers to the relationship between individual wealth and ecological pressures, with higher wealth correlating with a higher ecological footprint. The redistributive effect of basic income could therefore potentially go some way to reducing this effect. In addition, we know that more equal societies have lower levels of conspicuous or status-based consumption, whereby people purchase goods to demonstrate their social status, keep up with their neighbours, or trying to impersonate personalities they may see in the media. Now, redistribution under a basic income would naturally increase the consumption of the poorest. While this is necessary for meeting basic needs and also completely socially just and an obvious goal of basic income, it does have to be noted that the consumption amongst the poor does tend to be more carbon and resource intensive. So this is something we need to take into account when implementing a basic income and address through complementary policies. For example, some people call for complementing a basic income with overall caps on emissions and resource use. The burden of this would have to be borne by the wealthy through reducing unnecessary or overconsumption, which in turn could have additional positive impacts on the wealth effect. Another way in which basic income could contribute to a just or green transition is through reductions in working time. Basic income obviously provides the opportunity for people to say no to exploitative work, but it would also give people the opportunity to say no to work that has limited social or ecological value, or even to exit the labour force altogether. Now, under green growth approaches, reducing the supply of wage labour is seen as a negative. However, the post-growth literature argues that much of the labour we do has questionable social or ecological value. Therefore, by allowing people to exit wage labour, people will be able to spend more time on socially beneficial activities, such as volunteering, care work, growing their own food, activities which are more time intensive, but often also less material or resource intensive. And this can also apply to leisure, whereby when people are given more freedom from wage labour, they could choose to spend their leisure time with family and friends, or spending time out in nature or on arts or cultural activities, rather than having to rely on the quick material pleasures offered by material consumption. So I'm therefore arguing that a basic income compatible with a just and green transition should seek to shift work towards activities in the reproductive economy, rather than trying to ensure a continued increase in the supply of wage labour. Well, while people may choose to labour less under a basic income, we do know that their motivation to participate usefully in their communities doesn't diminish, and if anything, increases. Freeing people from wage labour could therefore help stimulate increased social participation, collective action, and local direct democracy. It could also free up people's time to campaign against and address some of the social or ecological challenges that they face in their communities. And we also know that social participation is itself a fundamental human need. Evidence from various basic income pilots suggests that under basic income conditions, people do increase their participation in their local community and in community activities. However, if we want to get a full understanding of the collective benefits of basic income, I'd argue that we need more pilots which adopt community saturation approaches, whereby a basic income is given to the community as a whole, rather than targeting individuals or specific groups. So the previous few points have demonstrated the potential of basic income to improve human well-being, or in other words, to improve human needs satisfaction without necessarily increasing our aggregate material consumption. Through redistributing material resources, reducing inequalities and their negative ecological impacts, realigning work with social and ecological value, and increasing our opportunities for social participation, collective action and direct democracy, a basic income could, in theory, give us the freedom to better satisfy our human needs while simultaneously reducing our material footprints. An important question, of course, regarding the ecological potential of basic income is how it's funded. For example, a basic income funded by cuts to existing welfare or public services would have negative social and ecological implications. In addition, a basic income funded through growth-based taxes would not be compatible with the just green transition outlined in this presentation. However, funding a basic income through wealth taxes or progressive income taxes could help to reduce inequality. In addition, Pigouvian taxes, such as carbon or resource taxes, have obvious ecological benefits. The redistribution of the income from these taxes through a basic income would also help to reduce some of their regressive impacts. Another method could be a commons dividend or a commons capital fund, such as that Guy Standing spoke about in his keynote speech yesterday, whereby a levy or a charge is placed on companies who benefit from the use of the commons. And this could be another ecologically sustainable funding mechanism. And there are others, but the important point to note is that the ecological credentials of basic income will depend on how it is funded. These credentials will also depend on the complementary policies, which we know make a big difference to the impacts of a basic income. Previous basic income pilots have shown that with the right complementary policies, we see increased health benefits, equality, and social participation. This is important as it demonstrates that basic income is not a silver bullet, but should be seen as one of a suite of policies for a just and green transition. So I just want to offer a few, well, conclusions may be the wrong word, but a few points that would hopefully stimulate some discussion in this area. But a review of the literature basically shows that we can argue that basic income could have an important role to play in a just green transition if funded appropriately and accompanied by the appropriate complementary policies. However, I'd say that we still lack the empirical data to fully justify these assertions, and also to understand how best to implement a basic income in a way which maximizes its ecological potential. My PhD research aims to contribute a little to this gap. I'm hoping to increase our understanding of how basic income impacts on ecological footprints, on time use, and on human needs satisfaction. However, if we want to properly understand these areas, we need more and we need better data. I'm therefore arguing for greater collaboration between the post-growth and basic income worlds, both at the research and the activist level. This is needed in order to push for pilots and the implementation of a basic income eventually, which embraces post-growth perspectives and therefore it contributes to ecological sustainability. I'd say we need pilots which improve our understanding of how to implement a basic income, which is ecologically sustainable, one which would reduce aggregate material consumption, help shift work towards socially and ecologically beneficial activities, increase social participation, and therefore improve human needs satisfaction while reducing our pressure on the environment. In short, we need pilots which would inform us of how to implement a basic income in a way which maximizes its ecological credentials and therefore contributes to a just and green transition. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick Langridge, for your brilliant presentation. I like the quote, basic income is one of the sweeter policies for ecological justice. I'll steal that if I may. So to have a bigger Q&A session at the end of our 4 presentations, I would like to hand over immediately to Serkan Simsir, who is unfortunately now in the attendee room instead of the presenting room. But no worries, he has handed in a pre-recorded video. Case in point, does basic income contribute positively to ecological justice? The case of the Alaska Permanent Fund. I would like to have the tech support to play the video now and put questions to Nick's presentation in the chat. Please do so. We will handle them in the Q&A session afterwards.
Hello everyone, I am Serkan Simsir. I am a PhD student at the Department of Political and Social Sciences at Marmara University in Turkey. I am working in the fields of basic income, social justice, gender equality, and poverty. First of all, I am very happy to be a part of such a great organization. I would like to thank everyone who contributed to this organization, especially the Center for Policy Futures. I hope we will have a nice and productive Congress together. Today, I will present to you my article titled, Does the Basic Income Contribute Positively to Ecological Justice? The Case of the Alaska Permanent Fund. As the name implies, the article aimed to test the potential contributions of basic income to ecological justice through a concrete example. In this plane, in the study, three important ecological arguments in favor of basic income were compared with the results of the experience of the Alaska Permanent Fund. The research was conducted in two parts. In the first section titled Ecological Arguments for Basic Income, the theoretical background of the research was created by examining the three main arguments in favor of basic income from an ecological perspective. In the second part of the study, titled Alaska Permanent Fund and Ecological Justice, the example of the Alaska Permanent Fund was examined within the framework of three main arguments in favor of ecological justice and basic income. In this direction, qualitative research methods were used in the study. The theoretical framework of the study was created by analyzing the data obtained after secondary data analysis and document review with an interpretive approach. Then, the contributions of the Alaska Permanent Fund to ecological justice were examined. And after the analysis of the data obtained, the results were compared with the theoretical framework created. The study was completed with the conclusion and recommendations section. After secondary data analysis and document review, it was determined that ecological arguments for basic income were concentrated around three main arguments. First argument is, due to environmental restrictions, basic income can serve as an incentive mechanism at the point of necessity of the lower expectation about increasing material living standards. Second argument is, by separating income from productive and growth-based ethics, basic income can act as a brake system against the relentless desire for growth. Third argument is based on assumption that nature and natural resources are the common property of humanity. Resources can be transferred through basic income from those who own or have the right to use nature and natural resources to those who do not own or do not have the right to use nature and natural resources. And these contribute to ecological justice. After the determination of these three arguments, these arguments were tried to be tested through the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is a kind of a basic income. In this way, the robustness of the arguments was tested on a concrete example. After comparing the arguments with the results of the Alaska Permanent Fund, three conclusions were reached. The first conclusion reached as a result of the research is that a basic income to be paid at the level of the Alaska dividend would be insufficient to encourage people to reduce their material standard of living. As the case of Alaska shows, people spent with the dividends they received and did not withdraw from the labor market. Even as the poverty-reducing effect of the Alaska dividend shows, the material living standards of especially low-income individuals have increased. The example of Alaska shows us that if basic income is paid at these levels, argument number one, I mean the argument that basic income can offer incentive to lower material living standards will be invalid, and it becomes clear that basic income cannot contribute to ecological justice in this context. The second conclusion reached within the scope of the research is that the basic income to be paid at the level of the Alaska dividend will not cause any paradigm changes in consumer habits and people's views on life. Because in the case of Alaska, after basic income, people have not left the labor market, have not made attempts to tame uncontrolled growth, have not acted with ecological concerns, have not turned to leisure, and have not tried new ways of life. Even the dividend has directly had a stimulating effect on the local economy. In this regard, the example of Alaska shows us that if basic income is paid at this level, argument number two, I mean the argument that basic income will act as a brake against uncontrolled growth will be invalid, and it becomes clear that basic income cannot contribute to ecological justice in this context. The third conclusion obtained in the research is that a basic income that will be financed by taxing the use of nature and natural resources or distributing the income derived from them to people constitute a paradox that will both contribute to ecological justice and harm it. Such a basic income can contribute to ecological justice since it can be easily argued that the use of fossil fuels and non-renewable resources will continue in the coming years, given the low use of renewable energy resources in the production of energy, goods, and services. Considering these resources as the common property of humanity, sharing the income obtained from these resources with other people will be a gain for others who will not gain any benefit otherwise and will contribute to ecological justice. On the other hand, the philosophical and ethical basis of the basic income to be financed in this way is weak, since an income from a source that pollutes the world causes many deaths and increases global warming, even though it reduces poverty and tames inequalities, it essentially harms humanity and makes the world unsustainable. For this reason, we can talk about a paradox here. In this regard, the example of Alaska shows us that argument number three, I mean the argument that basic income financed by taxing the use of natural resources will contribute to ecological justice, is both valid and invalid if the basic income is paid through taxation of the use of nature and natural resources or the distribution of income from them to individuals. The study has reached these three results, and a significant difficulty has been encountered in the study. It is worth noting that although it is defended as a type of basic income, the Alaska dividend differs from basic income in many ways, and the dividend paid is at a fairly low level. Therefore, it has been difficult to test the effect of a possible basic income on the example of the Alaska dividend, since the effects of a basic income that will be paid to people at a level where they can live an independent life will indubitably differ from the effects of the Alaska dividend. For this reason, it is important to carry out studies supported by larger empirical data to measure the effects of basic income on ecological justice. However, the fact that basic income experiments are small-scale experiments and are generally made through relatively low payments creates an obstacle to conducting such researches. Still, the Alaska sample is an important test tool and has the potential to host more detailed examinations. In this context, the Alaska sample is considered to be a valuable research area, and it is recommended to intensify the research on the Alaska dividend and its impact on Alaskans. Thank you for listening.
Very much, Serkan, for your presentation, and you made a very valuable point that basic income cannot contribute to ecological justice when it's financed from the exhaustion of finite resources. So we will come back to that in our Q&A session. Please post your questions to Serkan in the chat, and I will hand over to Liz Fouksman from the King's College in London, who will give us a presentation called UBI Post-Work and Post-Development, Charting Relations for the Future. Liz, if you're ready, please give us your presentation. Thank you.
So much. Can you see and hear me okay? Someone could indicate that.
And video is good.
Okay, thanks so much. So this is going to be an old-fashioned presentation, no slides. You just get to listen to me and it's live. So let's hope everything goes well. So I'm Liz Fouksman. I'm a lecturer at the Center for Public Policy Research at King's College London. And this is actually collaborative work that's co-written with Elise Klein. Usually we give this paper together, we split it up, but Elise, as you probably know, is one of the co-organizers of the Bien Congress. So she's off running the Congress dinner at the moment. So I'm going to try to do her section of it justice, but it is work that we're developing together. And Elise and I are both kind of empirical qualitative researchers, but this is a sort of theoretical, very scholarly exploration of a few strands of thinking. So it's going to be quite a theory-heavy paper, so just be forewarned. Okay, so what we'd like to explore in this paper is the connections between the future of work, the future of international development, something we're both interested in, and the future of the planet. And we'd like to tie together three strands of thought that engage with each of these futures, but have broadly not really engaged with each other. And that's post-work, post-development, and post-growth. And I think it's interesting that these are all post terms. So what does it mean to be post? Post delineates a sort of utopian vision of the future. But as with most post terms, including postmodernism or post-capitalism, post-work and post-development and post-growth both denote the end of something, but still need that thing to define themselves against, and still remain unclear about what it is that follows next. So it's clear what's being left behind, but it's not so clear where we're going. So what does the post actually look like? I think we use these terms because we don't actually know what that world looks like. We use post as a kind of demarcation of a space and an orientation of where we could head. But it's a matter of growing out of where we are rather than necessarily a clean break or a revolution towards something radically new. And we also want to make the point that all three of these post divisions, post-work, post-development, post-growth, are tied to major global crises. So wage, labor, and development, for instance, are failing so many people, and the climate crisis is well underway. And what we're going to try to do in this paper is to really bring these threads together by pointing out that underlying key things that feed into these issues, such as production and distribution, are all interlinked, in particular to climate injustice and expropriation. And in particular, we'd like to connect arguments that question and denaturalize the centrality of growth and production in the functioning of our economies, and theories that question and denaturalize the centrality of labor in our lives. And we're going to argue that, in fact, these are closely and necessarily interlinked in ways that have been under-theorized. So while post-development rethinks orthodox visions of production and accumulation, and post-growth or degrowth obviously questions the centrality and ecological viability of ongoing economic growth, we're going to make the case that you can't really rethink production or the centrality of growth without rethinking the role of labor and work, but not only in our economies and forms of distribution, hence, for instance, the importance of basic income, but also in our lives and our identities and moral frameworks. And as we'll explore more in a minute, while post-work theory, and with it much basic income advocacy, does question the centrality and valorization of work, it still largely does so within a focus on rich economies in the global north. And we're going to argue that you can't really talk about work in the global north without considering work in the global south. And that's where kind of the post-development paradigms come in. This is really made clear once you start taking into account frameworks such as racial capitalism and post-colonial theory, which really underscore the way that wealth accumulation in the global north has been tied to dispossession and expropriation and exploitation of the global south and in the global south. And is also really interlinked to our contemporary global economic system, where the global south remains the reserve of cheap and precarious labor underpinning global north wealth. So fundamentally, this paper is trying to ask what analytic possibilities and alternative visions of the future emerge if these three post-strands, post-work, post-development, post-growth or degrowth, are placed in conversation. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about post-work as a sort of starting place. And post-work, as I'm sure many of you already know, is a kind of umbrella term for a terrain of theoretical accounts and proposals and manifestos and sentiments that fundamentally seek to question and denaturalize the role that wage labor plays in the makeup of contemporary society. And this has a really long history dating back to at least Paul Lafarge's 1883, The Right to be Lazy. So post-work scholarship makes the case for decoupling commodified work from things like citizenship rights, social recognition, and the good life in general. Post-work argues in favor of a world where everyone can belong and live well and have worth, irrespective of their participation in wage labor. And post-work theorists argue that decentering work could be a pathway to a more utopian ideal of greater autonomy and creativity and justice and forms of flourishing based on having time for what most pleases us, in the words of Kathy Weeks, and the ability to lead a life based around multi-activity, to cite Andre Gortz. And for some post-work theorists, this vision can be achieved with the help of more democratized, more redistributed technological innovation and automation. But I want to emphasize here that automation is not essential or even always included aspect of post-work. And other post-work foci include the redistribution of necessary paid and unpaid work, for instance, through a shorter working week, or more equitably sharing care work, and the provision of economic security outside the wage, for instance, through a universal basic income, as well as the valuing and even valorizing of other forms of meaningful activity outside of wage work. So, as I'm going to expand on in a minute, there are clear parallels here between this future-oriented vision of alternative ways of flourishing and living within post-work and the visions of post-development and post-growth. But the connection between post-development and post-work, despite the obvious parallels, we think has yet to be analytically clarified. And this is perhaps because post-work has largely been grounded in academic disciplines of political philosophy and political theory, and as a result has been highly theoretical rather than empirical, and also very much focused on rich countries in the global north. In fact, some post-work theorists are very explicit about not wanting to engage with the case of countries in the global south. And yet, we want to argue that it's really impossible to not do this. As mentioned earlier, the accumulation of affluence in the global north is predicated on a very specific history of expropriation, exploitation, colonialism, slavery. These are all insights from works around the idea of racial capitalism. And the continuance of this affluence is predicated on a global economic system that uses the global south as a reserve of cheap production and cheap labor. So it assumes that, post-work assumes that the liberation from work can only be the purview of so-called developed countries, and there's a fundamental distributory injustice being committed here. And alongside that, I think it's really important to think of redistribution both of wealth, but also of time. So basic income might be able to allow this through not only a redistribution of money, but also by giving workers more power to bargain for shorter hours, as was mentioned in several of the previous presentations. But again, I think it's really important to think here about global systems and global inequalities and the way that this can take place, not just in affluent economies, for instance, by considering something like a global universal basic income or more global forms of redistribution. So another area that does consider the global south and these very specific histories is post-development. Yet the question of work and labor has been less of an explicit focus of post-development thinking, although something that is intrinsically connected, although it is something that's intrinsically connected to post-development's concern for what Escobar calls the core assumption of growth and economism. So post-development emerged in the 1980s, drawing on post-structuralist legacies to destabilize the discourse of development as a kind of hegemonic principle of organizing social and economic life. And post-development scholars made three quite specific critiques of international development as it was occurring at the time. First, post-development scholars pointed out that international development measures diverse societies by Western models of progress, where an individualized subject and capitalism is really taken as central. And the system classified many populations and many non-capitalist practices and ways of being as subordinate and automatically inferior, all while conveniently overlooking and silencing the darker side of modernity, including things like colonization, accumulation by dispossession, and exploitation. Second, post-development pointed out that the development industry hinges on processes that strongly privilege European and Anglo-American expertise and technocracy, systematically obscuring and masking, again, coloniality, patriarchy, and other relations of power through these ongoing projects of improvement and development. And finally, post-development pointed out that development industries deliver Western prescriptions while overlooking and marginalizing plural ways of being and diverse ecologies of knowledge and livelihoods and socialities. So here, post-development really isn't just an exercise in critique, but also offers a generative project that encompasses the promotion of different conceptions of the economy, taking into account things like solidarity, reciprocity, and other forms of value and valuation as opposed to the dominance of Homo economicus. So post-development scholarship has also expanded beyond a focus on development in the global south, and now I think equally addresses questions of development in the global north and stakes out a position about northern theory and questions of de-development in the global north. But while having a focus on issues on development in the global north and a promotion of other alternatives to development, post-development hasn't really had an explicit focus on the role of labor as sort of what we would argue a central piece of development discourse really around the globe in the way that post-work has. So we think that post-development has a lot to learn from post-work. Now, there are some important exceptions to this.
Liz,
the development.
You for a moment. You just had across the 12-minute mark. Are you fine with 3 to max 5 more minutes for your presentation? That would be very good.
Yes. Great. I'll do some cutting. So yeah, I'll try. So an important exception to this, as I was saying, is a kind of a classic work called the Development Dictionary from the 1990s, which is a classic post-development work that does problematize some Western capitalist production paradigms and mentions the problem of only seeing human progress within such a paradigm. Now, we had some quite concrete examples of the way that post-development can be linked to post-work, but I'm going to skip over these and maybe we can discuss them a bit in the questions. And I just want to finish off in my last 3 to 5 minutes by mentioning the link between post-development and post-growth or degrowth, because both question the core assumption of growth and economism, and both have a vision for alternative worlds based on ecological integrity and social justice. And ecological economics and post-growth theorists have, over the past decades, built an arsenal of arguments that connect planetary sustainability with the need to reduce rates of production and to disentangle our social norms of progress from the imperative of perpetual growth. And again, we've already heard quite a bit about this in the previous few presentations. Yet the ecological case for reducing working hours and devalorizing the work ethic is, I would say, still very much in its nascent form when it comes to conversations around something like degrowth. The arguments that connect understandings of the work-based society as ecologically harmful to imaginaries of redistributing and redefining work, I think, are underexplored both in theory and in policy, with some very significant exceptions. And it remains unclear how and if theories and imaginaries of degrowth and reducing work as a route towards ecological sustainability resonate in the global south. And this is where post-development can come in, where in the global south, unfortunately, growth is still seen through increasing economic output and production as kind of the dominant paradigm, as does the capitalist productivist work ethic. So to conclude and to tie things together, and again, I've skipped over a few quite concrete examples of some of these ideas that we can come back to in the Q&A perhaps. What possibilities emerge through thinking with these three strands all together? So what we've tried to hint at in this short presentation is a kind of generative intellectual project that starts to get at what this kind of world of post-work, post-development, post-growth could actually look like. And we would like to argue that there are fragments of post-work, post-development, post-growth that are interfacing and are already around us. So think, for instance, of indigenous struggles against the kind of rhetoric of job creation through extractivism, through things like mining that are happening throughout the global south. And again, I can go to some specific examples in the Q&A. And as Andrew and Nick have already described in their presentations, basic income studies scholars have long seen basic income as a critical redistributive tool to not only divorce income security from labor, but also to empower people with the economic stability necessary to decenter the role of work in our lives. And in so doing, decentering production, decentering growth, decentering employment should have obvious overlaps in our visions of sustainable futures around the world. But we want to emphasize that what's particularly essential in weaving these together, and this is kind of the post-development contribution, is grounding these post-visions in more pluriversal rather than universal perspectives. And I'll just end by pointing to the community economies work that's been done by J.K. Gibson Graham that has long argued that when we talk about the economy, what we need to be referring to is all of the practices that allow us to survive and to care for each other and Earth. And these practices don't all add up to a single system and can't be reduced to one particular logic or rationality. Rather, they're diverse, complex, contextually situated, and animated by multiple motivations and relational dynamics. So I'm going to end there, and hopefully we can get more into the nitty-gritty in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Liz, for your presentation. Old school, but very accurate and interesting. Thanks a lot. So, and I'm very glad that we have some time left for a quite proper Q&A session. And me being a chair, I'll start with one question that has been posted by Hans Heuer, and I'll read it out. It's for you, Liz. In the context of post-X, in which we can walk the path into the future, I have the question whether you think it is possible to formulate a mission statement for humanity on its planet that is common to all individuals, in which he can integrate their own biography and is prepared to give their best for the success of the mission. Liz, if you want to take the question.
Wow, that's a very big question. Not maybe that easy to answer. I think maybe a starting point is to think about the kind of the problems we face that we have in common. And obviously the climate crisis is an obvious one, but I think other problems such as inequality, growing inequality, is another. And the continuing failure of wage labor to incorporate people, to give people economic security, is a third. And maybe starting from that, but then allowing, you know, this point I ended on, allowing a more diverse, pluriversal vision of what the future could look like, that kind of takes what's in common, but also allows for diversity. And I think, you know, as a scholar and as someone that comes from a background of economic anthropology, I think this really needs to be grounded in empirics, actually. I think that these kind of post strands of scholarship too often kind of stay in the realm of theory. Theory is very important, but I think empirics is also really important. So I would argue for a project where we actually go and look at these kind of concrete, maybe very fragmentary attempts at creating this kind of post world. And they could be ranging from, you know, forms of post-capitalist collectives or alternative economies, or maybe anti-extractivist struggles, or people who maybe on an individual level are opting out of wage work. And I think it's kind of empirical scholarship around these attempts that needs to inform any kind of, you know, collective vision of the future. A bit hand wavy, but I think that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you, Liz, for this answer. And since there are no more questions, oh, there is one from Sean Kavanagh. I'll read that out. Kia ora, Liz, is the contemporary expression work-life balance an example of false equivalence, in that the value of life transcends that of work? Liz, if you're keen on answering this.
Sure. I mean, I would say I prefer to use the term maybe wage labor rather than work. But that's what work-life balance refers to, really. It's balance between wage labor and the rest of life. I mean, we do actually live a lot of our life at work. So it's kind of, I think it's a false equivalence because it's in our contemporary society in capitalism, it's very hard to disaggregate the two. And I think the post-work project is to really shift the value. I mean, as Sean says, to shift the value away from placing so much of it on wage labor and more of it on the rest of life, which I think was being somewhat ignored and certainly undervalued. So I think the short answer is yes, but I think you can sort of get into the nitty-gritty of what exactly are the borders between work and life. What do we mean by work? Can we shift the way we value activities and value activity and label activities in new ways?
Thank you, Liz, for answering this. A quote from David Graeber is coming up in my mind. He said, work-life balance is bullshit. It's always life.
Version, yeah.
Another question, maybe more suitable for Andrew's or Nick's presentation. How to dissolve the paradox between the need of financial growth to have investments in money terms and the impossible disassociation of growth from emission of greenhouse gases. That means, concerning your quote, Nick, there is no green growth, as you put it. Well, how to address this paradox? Any ideas?
Yes, I suppose I would question whether there is this need for financial growth. Personally, I see the financial sector as, to a large degree, kind of parasitic on more productive forms of economic activity. So I suppose you could ask yourself, is financial growth actually needed? Because, you know, the important thing is, if you are going to grow the economy, you grow in ways that are productive, or you grow in ways that are sustainable. So I guess I would kind of question the premise of the question, as it were.
Thank you, Andrew. I think the premise comes from the need to pay back any loan you take or any equity you accept in a company with the initial amount plus an X to address the foundations of our economic logic nowadays. So since we don't change the financial system, there is kind of a genetic need for financial growth. So the numbers have to be bigger every year. I think in that term, that was the premise.
So I guess what I'm kind of getting at is that I think you would have to kind of restructure the whole economy so that perhaps things like our consideration of financial investment kind of changes in a kind of meaningful way. So I think what I would say then is that, you know, this is within the context of UBI not being a kind of sticking plaster on the existing economic system, that you'd have to in some way, and I know this is very difficult to do, of course, in the short term, you'd have to in some way kind of restructure, I think, the whole global economy, as it were.
Thank you, Andrew. I think the next question could quite nicely go to Nick. It is from Yannick Gronemann. If a basic income that is financed by taxes that are built on economic activities that are destroying the environment, in brackets growth, is a paradox, how could a UBI even be financed in a post-growth society?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. You know, several of the taxes that we kind of raise currently are growth-based taxes. You know, that require economic growth in order to create the tax revenue that then gets returned and would be and would finance. You know, well, finances currently public services, but could also finance potentially a basic income. And that's, I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, that if you know the conception of a basic income that is compatible with a just green transition, which is built on post-growth perspectives, couldn't be financed through taxes that do rely on economic growth, in the same way that they couldn't be financed through cutting public services, cutting other forms of welfare that are still necessary and still have kind of social and ecological benefits. But it kind of speaking to kind of what Andrew was I think getting at in his response to the previous question, is there's plenty of wealth that it already exists, and there's plenty of resources that already exist within society that can be better redistributed. And so there's taxation that allows redistribution rather than having to create new money. So for example, through wealth taxes, or through progressive income or maximum incomes and things like that, which allow the redistribution of the wealth that already exists in society, to fund a basic income in that way. There's also some problems, as was pointed out in the presentation, about the Alaska permanent dividend fund, with the use of kind of more Pigouvian taxes like carbon or resource taxes. And while I think these would have like a really important role to play potentially in funding an ecological basic income, they're clearly not going to be a long-term solution. As you know, in an ideal world, we'd stop emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, so there'd be nothing to tax. But I think this also goes into a bit of a larger question in terms of when we think about basic income and its role in the transition to more kind of sustainable post-growth economies, whether basic income is a policy for the transition, or it's a policy that, you know, an end goal. And if it's the former, then, you know, funding it through things like carbon taxes and resource taxes might have a bigger role to play. And if it's the latter, then, yeah, as the question suggests, we do need to think about how we can do it in a way which redistributes existing wealth rather than relying on new growth to create new wealth.
Thank you, Nick, for answering this one. That was, a key or a tricky one. And Yeah, I would come up with a question that Andrew already addressed in the chat, but all the others should hear your answer as well. So kia ora, Andrew. What basic income advocates have in common with donut economics is that both mention the commons. What is Kate Raworth's stance on basic income, which could be argued is an example of circular economy? Andrew.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I articulated it as well as I should have done when I was writing it. But for those of you unfamiliar with Raworth's concept, you know, she looks at the donut and she says at the top of the outer ring is basically the kind of resources that we're using. So, you know, there's a limit to the number of resources we can use in terms of energy, plastic, and so on and so forth. If we want to keep if the planet is to survive in the long term. The inner ring is where it is all about living standards. So on the one hand, you know, we want to reduce consumption, we want to reduce the expending of all this energy, but at the same time, we want to make sure that people do not drop below a certain level in terms of their standard of living. So I think one is related to the other in the sense that, you know, we need to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. We need to reduce our reliance on things like economic growth. But at the same time, what we realize then is that is not going to create perhaps as many jobs in the future as we would like. It might lead to a kind of drop in wealth, which of course will affect disproportionately the poorest people in society. So again, as Nick was suggesting, this becomes an issue of redistribution. You know, we perhaps don't have as much wealth overall in society as traditionally we would conceive. So what we need to do is we need to redistribute what we do have to the poorest members of society to make sure their standard of living does not drop beyond a certain level.
Thank you, Andrew. Since we have no more questions, would maybe Nick or Liz like to add something on this circular economy question? Being in the donut and not in the hole and not outside of it.
Just add one quickly in terms of the commons perspective, which, yeah, I think is you know is prevalent amongst kind of within the basic income world, but also within the post-growth world more broadly. You know, Kate Raworth talks about it in Donut Economics, but it's also features prominently in the work of kind of Tim Jackson and Yoros Kallis, Jason Hickel, all speak of the commons and this idea that we actually have a large amount of wealth currently existing within our society that is just kind of shut off from the vast majority of people. Whether, I mean, you can look at it through land, you know, the amount of land that is just privatized and unavailable, particularly common land in the past, which, you know, was through primitive accumulation and the enclosures was taken out of kind of common hands into private lands. And Jason Hickel talks about the idea of degrowth being a theory of radical abundance, because it would, by kind of moving beyond this capitalist-based growth economy, it would allow us to look at more, you know, moving from private property rights to more usufruct rights, and how we can embrace the commons more to actually increase the general wealth of the vast majority of the population. Whereas at the moment, it's all very concentrated in a few kind of small hands. So there's a lot of potential, and there is, you know, a lot of kind of wealth available. And if we can use kind of a commons perspective and think about, you know, how can we actually make this wealth accessible to everyone, then I think there's a lot of potential there, and that does feature, as you say, a lot in the both the basic income and the post-growth worlds.
Nick, Liz, maybe?
I'm going to make a very similar comment to Nick, and I was also going to frame it as the necessity of thinking about consumption and what consumption occurs at the moment. A lot of consumption is what I would call sort of parasitic consumption, that you know, we can definitely if you think about redistributing consumption as well as redistributing production or resources, I think that can be helpful. If you think kind of excessive consumption of the wealthiest, you know, if you think of people buying super yachts and private islands and going to space and things like that, then suddenly you realize how much redistribution there is to be done, even without kind of feeding growth into the paradigm. And I really like the turn from degrowth to post-growth as a terminology, because as Nick was mentioning, I do think there's actually a lot of growth that can be had in ecological terms, and that's where I think post-work comes in. So the growth of leisure, you know, the growth of having free time, the growth of pleasure, but pleasure that doesn't take you know, necessarily physical resources, maybe the pleasure of the sunshine. I think all of that kind of needs to be fed into these post visions. And often I think when we talk about, say, degrowth, it's very much in these terms of sacrifice, of pulling back, of having less. But I think we also need to talk about having more, but again, more of what? More of time, more freedom, things like that.
Thank you, Liz, on summing this up and being precisely on time. We have reached the end of our session, and I would like to shout a big thank you out to all of the presenters and the patient audience. Thanks for having us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye from Vienna.
Bye.